I'm absolutely honored today to have with me author, radio host, community organizer, fellow YouTuber, Joey Villarreal. I know it's afternoon there in Califas Aslan. How are you
Mm.
today?
I'm well. I'm well. Under the conditions, I'm well, and thank you for having me on your show.
Right on. Maybe if we can just start with the viewers. A lot of people don't understand, even in Aslan itself, let alone the larger U.S. and the world. Can you tell us a little bit about what is Aslan? What is Chicano nationalism?
Absolutely. So Aslan is the national territory of the Chicano nation, and Aslan, this is, for people outside of the U.S. or even within these false U.S. borders who may not understand what geographical territory I'm talking about. This is the quote unquote U.S. Southwest. So the so-called Southwest states, this is the territory that was stolen 1846 and then 1848 by the U.S. In their imperialist drive toward, land grabbing half of Mexico. And so these states, we believe, are the national territory of the Chicano nation. And so that's the first part of the question of what is Aslan. Um, and I'll go a little bit farther. Aslan, the name Aslan itself, derives from the ancient Aztec people, or what's called the Aztec people is actually the Mexica. But the Aztec people, have in their history, having derived from Aslan. Aslan is the place of the white heron. So historically, this is where our ancestors migrated from this area, and they went down into the Valley of Mexico, and ended up establishing the city of Tenochtitlan. Tenochtitlan was the capital of the Mexica people, and so this is historically where the name comes from. The place of the white heron, Aslan, can be found only the only place in the world that herons, white heron birds, come from, is in the states that I spoke of, the quote unquote U.S. Southwest. So we know that this is where our ancestors came from, who populated what is now Mexico, the Valley of Mexico. And so we know that this is definitely the area where our ancestors came from. And then in the 1960s, 1970s, during the Chicano movement, the rise of the Chicano movement, the name Aslan was revived, and it was revived as a unifying symbol to unify the Chicano people. But again, that is, that was, as all matter is in constant motion, and so when it comes to nations, nations live and nations die. So no nation exists forever, and some live, some thrive, some die. Just like all matter, all phenomenon either regresses, or moves forward, or moves backwards and dies. And so today, for the Chicano nation, we believe that this territory is Aslan, and we call Aslan the Chicano nation, and Aslan is one and the same. And so for those today in today's Chicano movement, we see Aslan as the name of our nation. And people use the names interchangeably, Chicano nation or Aslan, and they mean one and the same. Now, going on to Chicano nationalism, or what I like to refer as Chicano revolutionary nationalism, because there's two forms of nationalism, as you know, most understand. There's bourgeois nationalism or cultural nationalism, which is very bad. I think it's very toxic. It's very poisonous, and it's very backwards. Cultural nationalism, or as one of the founders of the Black Panther Party, like to call it, pork chop nationalism. Huey Newton uh, coined it. Pork chop nationalism is, for the Chicano nation, that would mean people dressing up in, huipilis and, headdresses, or, what have you, speaking the Aztec language of Nahua, or, flying the Mexican flag, etc., having pride in their culture, but with no political content. And we know that's very bad, because all that would lead to, when applied to the Chicano nation, is cultural nationalism would simply be, it would only end up being brown capitalism, which very bad. So brown capitalism is no better than white capitalism or black capitalism. And so that's nationalism, bourgeois nationalism, cultural nationalism. And so for us today in the contemporary Chicano movement, we see the leading line, the leading political line, that's going to push us closer to liberation, being revolutionary nationalism. And revolutionary nationalism for the Chicano nation means that, yes, we do love our culture. Yes, we do embrace our culture and our ceremonies and all of the above. But we do so with the aim of accomplishing a socialist, liberated government for the Chicano nation, and ultimately, and joining the world nations in a future communist society. And we know it's not going to be done today, and probably not in our lifetime, but this is what Chicano revolutionary nationalism strives for. Today, we strive for national liberation. We are struggling in a national liberation movement to liberate the Chicano nation, to liberate our people and our nation, in order to create a free socialist government, where the Chicano nation and the Chicano people can determine our destiny and accomplish self-determination, for the nation. But when I say self-determination, I'm not just saying, we want to change the names of streets and schools, and, and have museums and be able to speak our languages, our cultural languages. Self-determination, when I say the Chicano nation wants self-determination, that's all the way up to forming our own socialist government. That's all the way up to having our own standing armies. And so this is, without a doubt, fully uprooting and overturning capitalism, and working in a united front. We also understand that here in these false U.S. borders, that this cannot be done. It cannot be done only by the Chicano nation, and we do understand that we do need a united front with others, with other oppressed nations, people, such as here in the U.S., the Black Nation, the First Nations, Boricua, and of course our allies, whether they are white allies or Asian allies, what have you, those comrades who also see that their role in an anti-imperialist movement is to support fully the oppressed nations, peoples within these occupied territories. And so we do see, those of us in the Chicano movement of today, and in particular the leading line, the leading political ideology within the Chicano nation today, does see that that we are an oppressed nation, within the U.S. That is, we are an internal colony within the U.S. We are colonized people, and we have our territories that are occupied at this time. We are not in charge of our own resources. We are not able to govern ourselves in our own socialist government, and so we are occupied and colonized, and have been so since 1848, in the beginning, of the birth of the Chicano nation. And since then, we have developed into a nation, and we do fit all criteria of a nation. And one of the main aspects of a nation, of course, is land. And our land has been occupied. When in 1848 we were, first colonized, um, our we were held under the vice grip of the U.S. government, and since then, we have not been able to have self determination. So this is something that we continue to strive for, and work for, and building, and I hope that we continue to have more allies in this movement. Unfortunately, the Chicano movement for national liberation within the U.S. has not really had much. Nobody's really talked about that, and that's something that needs to change, because we are a national liberation movement within the U.S. and it is an anti-imperialist movement, and more people have to know about that, and thank you for having me speak of this today. Yeah.
Right. I can tell that you've been doing this a while. That was a very kind of. I know I put you on the. Obviously I see you have no paperwork in front of you. That was all right off the brain, and it was very beautiful and well put. I just want to give a shout out to folks in the comments. I did tag you and share this on your page, and we
Thank
already
you.
got people from your page. We got Victor Rios, a Kalan. I'm probably pronouncing that wrong. Free Aslan. What up, Joey? We actually have one of our Australian comrades, Helen Woolley. Love the content, matter in motion. This man is a Marxist. That is a Marxist concept, and it was
And,
very well
yeah,
portrayed.
absolutely. And let me just
Go
say for
ahead.
the record, I'm a Marxist Leninist Maoist, by the way. But
Okay.
we're all comrades, and we all share the anti-imperialist struggle. So yes, absolutely. And I wanted to also mention, it's very important for anti-imperialists everywhere around the world, is that here in the U.S., and I've spoken about this before, but if we talk about imperialism, if we talk about imperialism, and we have to talk about what enables U.S. imperialism in particular, what enables U.S. imperialism to move forward and to continue to exploit around the world. And the main thing, the main tool that they have, the weapon that they have in order to exploit around the world, is their military. For many that don't know, there was something that was created in 1972 called the Chicano Moratorium. The Chicano Moratorium of 1972, August 29th of 1972, was an action that had the highest rate of Chicano people, over 10,000 people, or maybe 20, 30,000 people that were involved in these actions on August 29th, 1972. And it was against the U.S. war on Vietnam. And the U.S. war on Vietnam, that was, the Chicano people suffered, per capita, suffered the highest casualties, of that period, in, the U.S. soldiers, the Chicano soldiers that were involved. And so the Chicano Moratorium was formed, and ever since, every year, August 29th is commemorated as the Chicano resistance to U.S. Imperialism. This August that just passed was the 50th anniversary of the Chicano moratorium. Now, if we as anti-imperialists are, fighting to end imperialism wherever we may be, if we are doing that, the question, it begs the question: how can we stop U.S. imperialism? Well, the main contradiction within U.S. imperialism, I think the main thing holding us back in finally putting an end to U.S. imperialism is the military. And how are we going to stop the military? Well, the numbers today show that not only is the U.S. population browning, and in the next 20 years or so, brown people, brown people are going to be the highest populated group of people in the U.S., but that also spills into the U.S. military. Of brown people, the Chicano people are the highest, percentage of brown, quote unquote, brown people in the U.S. So if the Chicano people are the majority of the brown people, the Chicano people are now entering the U.S. military at higher rates than anybody, than any other nationality. So with that being said, the future of the U.S. military, like the future of the U.S. population, is brown, is Chicano. In order to stop the U.S. military, then we are saying that it is the Chicano people that are going to be the most, the highest population within the U.S. military. So to stop it would be to stop U.S. recruitment of Chicano people into its military forces. With that being said, the Chicano moratorium today is probably more important than it has ever been. And also, I would say for any anti imperialist in the US or beyond, I would say that, well, within the US, these false US borders, I would say the highest form today of anti imperialism, of any action that's anti imperialist, the most important action would be in supporting the Chicano moratorium today. Because supporting the Chicano moratorium is not just supporting the Chicano nation. It's not doing that. What it's doing is this is an act of anti-imperialism to support the Chicano moratorium today is to give a blow toward U.S. imperialism, because to stop the recruitment of Chicano people is to stop the future of U.S. It's to shut off the spigot, um, of bodies entering the U.S. military. So I just wanted to address that before I forgot that. And there's Chicano moratorium events throughout California and beyond. I know we had one in Oakland this year. We actually had two of them in Oakland, Khalifa Aslan, and there's also in Los Angeles has one, in East LA has one every year as well. And I'm sure that they're going to continue to grow. But I just, call on all anti-imperialists, and check the figures, check the facts. And so this is what I've been speaking about for the last few years, is that this is the highest form of anti-imperialism today, is supporting the Chicano moratorium, because we do have to end this exploitation around the world, and the U.S. military is the key to stopping it. So I just wanted to say that before I forgot. Yeah.
Right on. That's a lot of knowledge, bringing to the viewers here. Thank you. Quick shout out to Caroline Rainier, a Rasa educator here in North Carolina. Very
Oh,
good to get this information out there. Too. Um, maybe I lacked to mention this earlier. My guest is an author of both Chicano Power, Struggles for Aslan, and Aslan Realism. I guess people can get on the internet and look up those books. if they want to know more about this concept as well. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about your backstory, how how it was for you coming up, some of the struggles you've been through, and how you got involved in politics and how you acquired this knowledge.
Oh yeah. Oh, and it's very interesting. So, I grew up in San Jose, Khalifa Aslan, that's in California. And I grew up in the barrio. I grew up, I derive from, for politically conscious people, I derive from the lumpen population, and that is basically the underclass. I grew up in the streets. I grew up, in these youth survival groups that the state calls quote unquote gangs. I grew up in the streets. This is my background. I was incarcerated very early on when I was 11 years old. So I grew up in the juvenile halls, the state, the youth prisons, and the prison system. I was formerly incarcerated most of my life. And I grew up also in California's control units, first going there at the age of 21. And these are what they call security housing units. These are control units, extreme deprivation units that they basically capture prisoners in other prisons around the state. And they typically capture people of influence, people they feel are leaders, and people that resist, people that are politically conscious. And they send them to these control units. And they send them there for decades, and basically, some for the rest of their lives. So this is my background, and I became politically conscious. I've developed within the prison system. I began to study. I was a reader my whole life. As a child, 5, 6 years old, I loved to read. And when I began to be incarcerated, I continued to read. As I got a little older, I began to study more about history. Initially, the Mexican history, Mexican Revolution. Then I moved on to Central American Revolution and South America, of course. And then I kind of, learned all I can learn about this continent, and I started studying revolution around the world. It just became to fascinate me that oppressed people, oppressed nations, people can liberate themselves and can overturn and transform um, their situation and their social realities. So I began to do this and study revolutions around the world. Um, and of course, in those studies, I began to study the Russian Revolution of 1917. I began to study I began to study Marx. I began to study Lenin. I began to study Engels. I began to study Mao, and I began to study um, national liberation movements around the world. Um, and then while I was in prison, in the control units, and it's ironic that these control units are designed by the state in order to deprive people, to isolate people, and yet um, by having me in there, connected me to these beautiful liberation movements around the world. It's just I still just can't believe how they have me in this windowless cell. These are window. They build these cells with no windows, and they're meant to destroy the people that are sent there, to destroy them mentally, and to deprive them. And what happens is, in these prisons, the prisoners ourselves, we end up creating these study groups. We end up, and they're underground study groups because, the prison staff label any kind of organizing or prisoners communicating with each other, they label it as quote unquote gang activity. So even studying, let's say, Marx or Lenin, would be considered gang activity because anytime prisoners get together and conversate and have study groups on anything, it's considered gang activity. So we would form these underground study groups. And so I did that for, a little over 10 years. And in the midst of that, I ended up joining a political education correspondence course. And it was a revolutionary political science course. It was organized by an organization called MIM Prisons, the Maoist Internationalist Movement for Prison Ministries, and they basically organize these study groups for prisoners. They send in revolutionary materials, and so I joined this study group, and I was participating in it for a number of years. And in the midst of the study group, we studied all of the classics, and this is how I ended up, and in the midst of the study group, I did stumble upon the national question. And I just and it just blew me away how I was born and raised here, just like everybody else in these false U.S. borders, going to these brainwash camps, aka also known as schools, public schools, and I never learned about Chicano history or resistance. We in history class they never told us that Chicano people were a nation, that the black nation was a nation, that we were colonies, internal colony. We never knew that because, of course, the oppressor nation will never, politically educate the masses that they are colonizing. So, I never knew this stuff. So learning it in prison really blew my mind, and this is what encouraged me to continue. I was released from prison in January of 2017, and from that point on I began my organizing in the community. And I helped to found an organization called the Republic of Aslan, and get involved in today's Chicano movement and today's national liberation movement for the Chicano people, and to work with others and begin to make those political, this unity, build unity within the other oppressed nations people as well. So and then I created the my I have my radio show, Free Aslan. It's every Tuesday at 8 p.m. And you can listen to it online anywhere in the world, every Tuesday at 8 p.m. California time. And you can listen to it online at, it's one word, pourmagazine.org/radio. That's pourmagazine.org/radio. You log on, hit the live button, and check it out. I also formed my YouTube. It's called Free Aslan, and I give talks on there on many different political topics. And my books, like you said, the Chicano Power and the Struggle for Aslan is one book, and the other book is Aslan Realism. So, yeah, that's kind of where I came from and what led me to where I'm at today.
Right on. We can post a link to that both on the YouTube and on the Facebook to your radio program. Um, Shout out to David Fox, also from Australia. We do a show, Working Class Revolt,
Oh,
every Saturday. Um, wow, that's a that's a lot of information. Maybe you can tell us a little bit more about this radio program. This go live on FM local.
yeah, well, local, if you're in Oakland, you can listen live on the dial, on FM dial, 96.1 FM. If you're in Oakland, if you're outside of Oakland, then you can listen from anywhere in the world, online. And yeah, this it addresses it addresses any kind of movement, struggle, anti-imperialism, working class movements, of course, the Chicano nation. It also has a strong emphasis on prisons. In the U.S., for the viewers and listeners of this show today that are not within these false U.S. borders, you know, within the U.S., there's so many people in prison. There's over 2 million people in prison, and there's a couple of theories out there. Some people in within the U.S. in the movement for social justice, they point to mass imprisonment being what they call a PIC, the prison industrial complex. And I don't agree with this theory. I think that, in this theory, people put forward the idea that mass imprisonment of the 2 million plus people in the U.S. are due for financial reasons. I don't believe there's some financial gain from the state, but when you take into account how much it costs to house and feed and have these prisoners, and then medical care and electricity and all of the above, they're not really making a huge profit. I think that what I believe is that mass imprisonment in the U.S. is based solely on social control it's basically national oppression. It's a form of national oppression of the oppressed nations within the U.S., the Chicano nation, the Black nation, First Nations. And so this is a form of national oppression, just like racism. A lot of people say racism. I don't call racism racism. It's actually national oppression. If I go to a store and they look at me and don't want to serve me because I'm a Chicano, I'm not going to say this is racism. I'm going to say it's national oppression. If I try to rent a house in a neighborhood that's an all white or upper middle class bourgeois neighborhood, and they say, look at me, and they say, I'm sorry, it's been rented, and it really hasn't, and walk away, I'm not going to call that racism. Most people would. I would say it's national oppression. If I'm running down the street for my life and a police officer uh, shoots me in the back and kills me, some people will say it's racism. I wouldn't call it that. I would say that's national oppression. So the phenomenon that we see and we experience or we hear about or see on the news that most people call racism, because, as you know, race is not a real concept. It's not a real. It's a made up thing, right? It's made up to support white supremacy. So there's no such thing as race, right? It's a made up term, and so there's no such thing as races, but there are such thing as nations, nationalities. And so when I see these things take place, whether that's somebody hanging a noose to intimidate Black people, um, in a school or in a business or it's not, or in their front yard, it's not racism, it's national oppression. And so these things that occur is not racism. It's actually, taking a materialist viewpoint of these things, it's actually national oppression. Again, I see mass imprisonment as a form of national oppression. Because if you look at the prisons, it's mostly brown and Black, mostly Chicano and Black people who are imprisoned in the U.S. If you look at the death rows, it's mostly those deriving from the Black nation on death rows. If you look at the control units, the deprivation units that I was talking about, at least within the quote unquote Southwest states, if you look at the solitary confinement control units, it's mostly Chicanos. So this is national oppression. The mass imprisonment is national oppression. When you look at the facts, and the facts will tell you that within the U.S., if you look at drug users, for example, the majority of drug users are white. But we don't see that. We don't see that, of course, because the media, and 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 the media being the propaganda arm of America, doesn't tell us that. So every time we go to the movies, we look on TV, look on the news, we're just told brown people are getting their houses raided for drugs, black people are on the corners selling drugs. We're not told that the majority of drug users in the U.S. are white, and so and again, our prisons. If you look at all of the drug offenders that are in prison, mostly brown and black. But again, it's national oppression. The federal prison system in the U.S. is majority brown prisoners. So raza prisoners. So that's Chicano, Spanish speaking prisoners. Are those who derive from Spanish speaking countries. I don't like using the term Latino because it has a colonial relationship. I don't like using it. I would rather use the term raza, or just call people what they are: Chicanos, Salvadorians, Hondureños, what have you. So it's brown prisoners that fill the federal prison system. It's Chicano prisoners that fill the control units. It's mostly brown and black prisoners who fill U.S. prisons. And so this is national oppression, and yeah, so that's another thing that a lot of people, even a lot of comrades, don't, they may not even be familiar with, the prison system, or at least even integrated into their work, into their organizing. But it's very, I think it's very important, and in my opinion, because of the economic conditions and the development of capitalism in the U.S., and the deep root of white supremacy that exists within U.S. borders, I think that, in my opinion, um, the lumpen population in the U.S. Um, has a high potential for revolutionary mobilization. Um, and in some countries, people will say, well, we have to target the proletariat, the working class, and that may be true in some countries, and in the U.S., of course, any real revolution has to have the proletariat, the working class. You know, um, of course, absolutely. And at some point, I think conditions here may develop. They're not in that stage today, and only because capitalism has developed in a way here in the U.S. where even I would take a page from Lenin, where he talked about a labor aristocracy. Lenin talked about labor aristocracy back in his day. We're talking 100 years ago or so, where this was a problem. It was developing in Europe. It was developing in Russia and in England. And so if it was developing back then, how can we think it is not developing today in the year 2020? Not only that, but in the imperialist center of the world, in the US. Like, how can we not feel that workers here in the US are not, do not have some kind of, economical incentive, as far as, in their jobs and how they're paid and their living standards. We walk into a store, we can buy fresh fruit. We could walk into a pharmacy, we could buy medications that've been tested on third world peoples. We can walk into a restroom and flush a toilet. We could turn on a light switch. We can open our refrigerator. We can take 2 weeks vacation time and, go to, vacation and get paid for it. We have pensions. We have many privileges that people in the third world don't have. So workers here in the U.S., they are benefiting in some ways from the exploitation of third world peoples, and that's just being, you know, totally honest about, even me as a part of the oppressed nations within U.S. borders. As I said, I can do all of the things that I described, um, just like you, just like anyone else, from being born here and having this paper privilege, this paper citizenship of the occupying, oppressor nation. It's and so this is one of the things that I think that the lumpen population in U.S. borders plays a very key role in any future revolution on these shores. I think that the lumpen population, and again, the lumpen, I'm talking about the underclass. I'm talking about those, the chronically unemployed, the prisoners, those who are labeled as gang members, those who are, living in the underground economies. These this population of people, they don't pay taxes, they don't join the military, they don't have a stake in imperialism, they don't get any kind of privileges. They have more to gain from a revolution, and the least, to keep things in the status quo. And so this is going to be, in my opinion, this is going to be the backbone um, of any future revolution within these false U.S. borders, because this is this population of lumpen have a high probability, high potential of being revolutionary. And so, that's another thing that, is not talked about. And other countries are not different, are different. We have to examine the social reality of every country. And in some countries, I think the working class is ripe. Unfortunately, in the U.S., those conditions are not yet there. But the lumpen population, um, is right. And so this is a population that I try to focus on, especially within the Chicano nation. I really try to focus on the lumpen elements, and this is the population I work with, and I am down there in the barrios and in talking with these people from this population in order to organize and mobilize them, because it's just very hard for me to believe that we can walk into a union factory in the U.S. where they're being paid 70,000 a year or what have you, and get them to leave all of that and leave all of the benefits and privileges that they acquire in order to support a revolution where they're going to lose that stuff. So again, the lumpen population is key at this time, in my opinion, in organizing in within the United Snakes. So,
Right on. Let's see. I have a comment from Australia. The underclass is growing, and maybe I'll just say a little bit of my analysis, and maybe you can respond to it. In the last 30 years or so, well, even more, the last 50 years or so, since the 1970s, 1968 was the height of the American working wage in this country. And another part why we don't have communists in this country is because of McCarthyism. We lost in every country in the world. There is a communist party almost on every neighborhood. And the reason why, for you go in Germany, through Europe, Australia, that's what the comrades from Australia, we don't have that here because of McCarthyism. It was a brutal suppression. Some of the people that taught me had their parents took out of their house, and imprisoned, and it scared people out of the communist movement. So the first thing they did, they got rid of the communist movement. And then after they got rid of the communist movement, they kicked the communists out of the labor unions. And then there was a three-prong assault on both the international, the oppressed nations, and the working class. And that comes with the revolution in automation, neoliberalism, and globalization. And it started largely in the Chicano community and the Black community in the 80s, with the deproletarianization becoming lumpen. Basically, people were kicked out of the workforce, and it happened to brown and Black people first. They were kicked out of those good jobs, and they were forced into the lumpen. But that process has been expanding in this country. If you got now, we have opioid crisis, even rural America. People have lost these jobs in the Rust Belt. People are getting hooked on pills. The lumpen proletariat is growing. The conditions are getting worse, and I think that there's more time forever for solidarity, wherever and however we can find it, to fight against imperialism. And there's no, I mean, and that's why I look to leadership in Afro American, in Aslan, because they dealt with the struggles. The shit we're just starting to, people are being forced into and starting to struggle with. Y'all been in the struggle and did that, and we're just like opening our eyes to the coming conditions that the working class and the oppressed nations have gone to go through, and just the knowledge that you're dropping out here. I hope it gets as wide audience as possible. The more people to understand the struggles of the oppressed nations, the struggles of the working class. Any response to that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I agree that, around the 1980s was the turning point. And for the Chicano, for Aslan, Aslan suffered around that period, late 70s, early 80s, with the COINTELPRO, the
Mm-hmm.
counterintelligence program that was unleashed on the oppressed nations here in the U.S. And the counterintelligence program, for some who don't are not too familiar, it was basically the FBI's program against revolutionary movements within the U.S. And a lot of people, a lot of the leaders of both the Chicano movement and the Black movement, liberation movement, were murdered. Were murdered. And those who weren't murdered were sent to prison. They were sent to prison. For some are still in prison. And so what they did is it's by basically attacking the leadership of these movements. um it was a big blow toward the Chicano movement, the Black movement, and the American Indian movement. So, and that was around the late 70s, around that period. So coming into the 80s, definitely the oppressed nations were, they suffered, and a lot of their leadership was gone. They were either killed off, imprisoned, or forced underground. So that's something that occurred. And as a result, in these communities, then here comes the early 80s, when we know from you know you know Gary Webb was, I have to give props to Gary Webb, the journalist that published in the Mercury News, the San Jose Mercury News, my hometown's newspaper. And he published a series of articles on the introduction of drugs by the U.S. government, of crack cocaine, of cocaine, during the so-called Iran Contras trial, scandal. And they were bringing cocaine from Central America. They were, putting it here in the cities, flooding these, the oppressed nations communities, the brown and Black communities, with cocaine and drugs. So on the one hand, they take away the leaderships of these movements with COINTELPRO, their counterintelligence programs, kill or basically neutralize kill or imprison the leaderships. And then once they're gone, flood the communities with drugs. And this was the rise of quote unquote gangs. This was the time when 80s is when we seen quote unquote gangs erupting, because there was no more political leadership in the communities that used to organize there, and the injection of drugs. And this is when we seen this rise, and so it worked in the state's favor, definitely. And now, we are starting to, declaw some of that repression, in the oppressed nations communities. And we're also seeing a new politicization, of even within the prisons. And we're seeing this development rise in these hunger strikes in U.S. prisons, where you see different nationalities: Chicano prisoners, black prisoners, white prisoners, Asian prisoners, First Nations, all coming together in hunger striking. So they're basically they're revealing a class consciousness, and that hasn't been seen in since the 1970s. So now we're seeing prisoners, U.S. prisoners, turning these prisons into liberation schools. And this is, I think this scares the state the most. This scares the state the most because what's going to happen is we're going to see a rise in politically conscious prisoners, of prisoners being released from prisons and mobilizing their communities. Chicano prisoners mobilizing the barrios. We're going to see black prisoners being released and mobilizing the black ghettos. We haven't seen this, and this will inject a new fire, a new energy into the movement at large within the U.S. We haven't seen this fire since the 1970s. This was. If we look to the, and this again highlights the importance of the lumpen population once politicized. If we look to revolutionary organizations, resistance groups within the U.S., I think I think the highest development of of a revolutionary organization in the U.S., in my opinion, was the Black Panther Party. I think the Black Panther Party showed the highest level of development. It was named, the most the highest threat to national security by J. Edgar Hoover. And what scared the hell out of the U.S. government, coming from the Black Panther Party, is that they weren't just organizing college educated comrades in the suburbs. And I have no issue with college level educated. I mean, all leaders, Marx, Lenin, even Mao, were college educated. I have no nothing against this population here in the U.S. And I have a lot of comrades that are professors and doctors and lawyers, and I have a lot of comrades of this class, deriving from this class. But what I'm saying is, an organization that is only organizing with this class of people is not going to threaten the state as much as an organization that is mobilizing the lumpen population. These are people that have nothing to lose and everything to gain from a revolution. So the Black Panther Party mostly recruited from the black lumpen. These are ex-gang members, ex-drug addicts, ex-prostitutes. These are people from the street, from the hood. They were now politicized. They were now on the street corner selling Mao's Little Red Book. These were people this is a political party that was not only in the black ghettos across the U.S., but now they were making political ties, traveling around the world with revolutionary leaders of countries. This posed a huge threat to the U.S. And so, and again, this is the population that has nothing to lose, but the chains, of oppression that they were experiencing. So this was, this really threatened the U.S. And I think that, and rightly so, they understood. They have, unfortunately, they have people that study our social reality more than we do, more than we do. And so they seen the threat that the Black Panther Party posed. And I would just say that it's important to note that also the Black Panthers were revolutionary nationalists. And so again, every country is different. And I know in other countries, the highest developed um, political revolutionary group is going to look different, and it's going to come from probably a different class and a different social background, etc. Here in the U.S. is unique. It's unique because of, again, because of the strong, the deep roots of white supremacy, of the colonization that exists, and the oppressed nations people that exist. So it's different than other countries, and we have to examine it. We are here, and so we should be able to examine it. Um, we should be able to examine it very well because we are here, and we know the social reality. So, again, yeah, I would just say that, yeah, I agree. Ultimately, that we do need unity, we need solidarity, we need a united front, and we need people to come together. And we also need the right political line. We have to have comrades who understand that, the importance of things like the Chicano moratorium. How could we say we're anti-imperialist and not support um, the Chicano moratorium? Is a direct attack on U.S. imperialism. It's shutting off the spigot that enables the engine of U.S. imperialism to continue around the world. So we have to identify the principal contradictions in the U.S. today, and the Chicano nation holds a seat, a definite seat, in that analysis. And it's important that we begin these conversations that should have been had decades ago, on the social forces within these false U.S. borders.
Right on. That's a lot of stuff to go through. I really like the slogan from the Panthers: "From the masses to the masses."
Mm,
Beautiful, beautiful stuff.
absolutely.
I think you're putting it out there,
Oh, yeah.
doing with the work. Maybe you can tell us a little bit more about some of your activism in the current period.
Absolutely. So, today, as I said, I'm very involved in the Chicano moratoriums. That's something that, I'm very involved with, and we organize every year for that. Even within Aslan, many Chicano people don't see the ties to anti-imperialism, with the Chicano moratorium. So that's work that I try to do as well, to educate, and provide that political education, to Aslan, as far as the anti-imperialist nature of the Chicano moratorium. Also another thing that concerns me very much is the children that are held in these ICE detention camps. These are migrant children, and migrant people are, this is the lifeblood of Aslan. This is where our population derives from migration. And so it's very important to Aslan that we continue to have migration, and we continue to, but even in a humanitarian sense, it's wrong to have these children in these cages. It's wrong. It's like, that's another thing that I think that all anti-imperialists should support these struggles. And we have a lot of actions here in California concerning the kids in the cages. And that's another thing that we, the Chicano Nation, the Aslan, goes to a lot of actions. We support everything, from the attempted destabilization of Venezuela, the attacks on Palestine, free Palestine, by the way. We support all of this stuff, all of these struggles. We support the Black Lives Matter. We support all struggles against injustice. But when it comes to actions against the kids in cages, and I've been to a lot of actions about kids in cages, and when I look around at these actions, I mostly 90+% of the people at these actions are Chicano, are brown people. So, I think that another thing that's very important is that other people start supporting these actions. This is a form of anti-imperialism as well. It's the U.S. attacks on the third world. And yet we don't see a lot of other comrades outside of Aslan, outside of the Chicano community, coming to support these actions against ICE, against having children in cages. And I think that if these children were, if they weren't Chicano, if they were Asian children, if they were white children, if they were black children, would the U.S. left still not show up, or would this be their priority? And so we have to ask these questions with groups that we work with, organizations, and unfortunately, many times, issues like this are put on the back burner, and I think that's a big, again, I think that's dropping the ball again. That we have to understand the social forces in the U.S. and when we see acts of deep injustice, like with the children in these cages, I think more people within the movement have to get involved. And so I'm also very involved in the prison movement, and just a brief snapshot of what I'm talking about. Some may not know the prison movement. So the prison movement is these are, we have a lot of comrades in prisons. We have people organizing in prisons and outside of prisons. Most of the people a part of the prison movement are either ex-prisoners or are family and friends of prisoners. This includes political prisoners. And, I believe that most prisoners in the U.S. are political prisoners, not just those who committed political acts to go to prison, because the laws in the U.S. are political. The courts are political. So there's definitely, all aspects of society have a class stamp to them. It's political, and everything we deal with is political. So the prisons are definitely political. The prisoners, in my opinion, and so that's another area that I focused on, and I think is very important. And so the prison movement is basically, these are comrades and people that are, involved in social justice work, who do see the importance of prisoners and the importance of politicizing prisoners. Most people, most leaders in social movements within the U.S. Have been to prison at one time or another. Some of the most revolutionary leaders of our time in the last 100 years have been to prison. So, prisons is another area that I think is that I focus on. prison organizing, um, migration, focusing on the Chicano moratorium is very important to me today. Another thing is the unjust murders by police. That's an area that I organize within as well. And these police murders are being seen around the world now. And this is another area that it's very concerning, because this is national. When we see people being murdered by police, we're talking national oppression at its apex. This is like the highest form of national oppression is murder, is the outright murder. And they're not being murdered because of what they said, or how they're being murdered because they're brown and black. Let's be real here. And so, that's the highest form of national oppression that we're facing today, that and death row. And for those reasons, this really concerns me. And these are the areas that I'm mostly organizing with today. The unjust police murders, the Chicano moratorium, the kids in the cages. These are things that have a high priority for me and those who I work with.
We went a little bit over the hour. Um, that dropping a lot of knowledge on us. I'd love for you to come back,
Absolutely.
maybe further interviews or discussions or studies. I want to thank you for taking your time out of the day, for being with us.
Well, thank you, and thank all the viewers and listeners out there. And yes, the workers of the world have to unite. And with that, I say free Aslan.
All right. Thank you.